Lincoln County, New Mexico, March 9, 1878. Dick Brewer's pale face displays a look of horrified shock as his horse nears the 3 fallen bodies of his prisoners. Motionless upon the earth in Blackwater Canyon lie Buck Morton, Frank Baker, and William McCloskey. Morton and Baker had been arrested by Brewer's posse just 3 days prior after a miles-long horse chase. They were issued a warrant by the Justice of the Peace on account of their involvement in the murder of John Tunstall. Tunstall was a friend and employer to many of the men in Brewer's party, having worked for the young Englishman at his cattle ranch. The cold-blooded execution of Tunstall was committed after the Lincoln County Sheriff William Brady sent a detachment of men to wrangle cattle from the Tunstall ranch on behalf of a debt owed by Brady's competitor and the business partner of John Tunstall, one Alexander McSween. McSween, a lawyer from St. Louis, had recently settled in Lincoln County with high ambitions. He endeavored to make a fortune for himself in the cattle and dry goods business in the profitable southern New Mexican mountains. The only issue with his lofty aspirations was the near monopoly on these interests held by Sheriff Brady and his partner, James Dolan. Tensions were present from the arrival of McSween and his British business partner, John Tunstall. Brady and Dolan, as well as the numerous men who were allied with them, profited from their cattle trade and their store, known simply as the House, and they were immediately leery about the bright-eyed newcomers attempting to carve out a piece of their pie. McSween would cross a red line that had set off a chain of hostile events sparking the Lincoln County War. A local resident hired McSween to represent them in the service of procuring a life insurance payout for a recently deceased family member. McSween would travel back east and spend several months' effort in securing the sizable payout of the insurance claim. However, the would-be recipient of the claim had also inherited a large debt to the house from the policyholder. If McSween were to deliver the payout to them, the money would almost entirely be going to help his competition. McSween, acting on business instincts instead of morals, withheld the payment to inflict damage upon Brady and Dolan as their legal efforts to come into possession of the funds played out. Sheriff Brady, a lawman with Irish roots and a temper as fierce as the Emerald Isle is green, gained a judgment from the court to attach McSween's property in service of the debt. And attach property he did, storming into McSween's office and selecting far more property than necessary to satisfy the debt. But the sheriff did not stop there. He sent a determined posse of his men to Tunstall's ranch to attach his cattle to the debt of McSween. Tunstall was not implicated in the ruling against McSween, but the sheriff sought to use this opportunity to make a clear statement to his advisers and inflict maximum damage upon them. John Tunstall approached the sheriff's posse alone as they descended upon his ranch, and was shot down with bitter indifference by Brady's men. Tunstall's men had been herding cattle and were attempting to catch up to Tunstall as he made his solo approach, but were only in time to see his still warm body lifeless upon the ground as the sun began to sink behind the mountains. The group of men would label themselves the Regulators, and they set out for vengeance on behalf of John Tunstall. They would even be deputized by the Justice of the Peace and capture Morton and Baker in early March. Dick Brewer had been the de facto leader of the party, but had faced a veritable mutiny as his men went against his wishes and executed Morton, Baker, and McCloskey as Brewer was attempting to return the men to Lincoln to stand trial for the crime against Tunstall. The Lincoln County War still stands as a timeless narrative that echoes forth from the ages of the Old West. It embodies within it many parables and much hard-learned wisdom, and as the escalations continued to mount, the truism that 2 wrongs don't make a right, and an eye for an eye would make the whole world blind, stand atop that list. The 2 deadly exchanges between bitter enemies of the war would not be where the hostilities ceased. The bodies of Baker, Morton, and McCloskey lay in what has come to be known as Dead Man's Draw. Brewer would enlist the help of New Mexican natives to bury them. The rest of the posse did not continue on to Lincoln with Brewer as he grimly rode into town to deliver the news and surrender himself. Brewer arrived in town on the 10th, just a day after McSween had returned himself. After seeking the counsel of his attorney companion, Brewer decided to face whatever legal ramifications were coming his way for his role in the Blackwater disaster, even if it meant his own death. The violence in the southern reaches of the territory had summoned the governor of New Mexico to travel to Lincoln and intercede, but the townspeople hoping for an impartial authority to set their troubles at ease would be further disappointed. Governor Axtell arrived in Lincoln on the morning of March 9th, and he spent just 3 hours investigating the matter that had gripped his southern territory, doing so while in the ever-present company of James Dolan. The governor deferred the opportunity to interview any neutral parties in the region, nor did he request a meeting with McSween to diplomatically attempt to find a resolution and bring about peace. As the citizen attempted to inform Axtell on the confluence of events that had led them to this precipitous situation, he simply demurred, "I know all about the matter and its cause, and I have already taken such action as I deem necessary." The governor's vague response to the citizen may be cleared up with his official decree. The primary action that would be taken by the governor on account of his trip to Lincoln, which would appear in the Cimarron News and Press on March 21, 1878, and contain, in part, the following. To the citizens of Lincoln County, the disturbed condition of affairs at the county seat brings me to Lincoln County at this time. My only object is to assist the good citizens to uphold the laws and keep the peace. First, John B. Wilson's appointment by the county commissioners as Justice of the Peace was illegal and void. Second, the appointment of Robert Weidman as U.S. Marshal has been revoked. Third, the President of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes, upon an application made by me as Governor of New Mexico, has directed the post commander, Colonel Purington, to assist territorial civil officers in maintaining order and enforcing legal process. The governor's decree had retroactively undermined the efforts of the regulators to bring Tunstall's assailants to justice. By voiding John B. Wilson's appointments as Justice of the Peace, the warrants he issued for Morton and Baker were also vitiated, as well as his deputizing of the regulators. Now, the only officers of the court were Brady and his deputies, which included the remaining men who had carried out Tunstall's execution. The governor then went so far as to invoke the President of the United States to send a military intervention to the county to carry out the suppression efforts on behalf of Sheriff Brady. If Governor Axtell had intended to deliver a crushing blow to the citizens who were already working themselves into a rebellious fervor towards the county authorities, his effect had done just the opposite. After the one-sided proclamation and the disregard for the cold-blooded slaying of Tunstall, the time for relying upon the system to bring about justice was long over. Dick Brewer had learned of the governor's action from McSween upon his return, and his resolution to face the legal ramifications for what had occurred in Blackwater would be drastically altered. McSween instead instructed Brewer to give Lincoln County a, quote, wide berth until court was convened and there may be clarity brought to the issues plaguing the county. Brewer would leave during the night to his farm in Ruidoso. He would also deliver the message to all those who had been deputized that they were now essentially outlaws, stripped of all law enforcement abilities. On Monday the 11th, Alexander McSween fled Lincoln as well. He would take refuge in the town of Pecos, within John Chisholm's ranch. It was his plan to stay thereabouts until court had convened, then stand trial on embezzlement charges for his role in withholding the life insurance funds from his client. On the 13th, just 2 days after McSween's exit from Lincoln, the Jesse Evans gang would appear on the scene once more. The gang, now without members Baker and Morton, still boasted its namesake Jesse Evans, as well as his favored accomplice, Tom Hill. The outlaw gang had acted as mercenaries on behalf of Sheriff Brady in the death of John Tunstall, and had been hiding out in the Sacramento mountains. They moved down from their hideout towards Tularosa, and would come upon the camp of German sheep herder John Wagner. Jesse Evans and Tom Hill were at this point desperate for supplies and provisions. Wagner had been herding a flock of nearly 4,000 sheep from California en route to Concho County in Texas. He had made camp near Tularosa and was out with his flock when Evans and Hill descended into his camp. Only the driver of the wagon was present in the camp when the gang members began looting, and they were so focused on their objective that they failed to see Wagner approaching them alone as he returned to the camp. The elder herdsman grabbed a hold of a rifle belonging to Hill, which the intruder had left leaning upon a tree, and began firing with lethal intention upon the men. Tom Hill was immediately killed, and Jesse Evans was seriously wounded, having been shot twice, with one shot hitting him in the wrist and another penetrating his lungs. Improbable as it was, Evans managed to make an escape on horseback, riding into the night into the Oregon mountains, where he would reach Shedd's ranch and be given a welcome reception. Evans would hole up there for a few days, but his grave condition prompted him into turning himself into Fort Stanton, so he could be given care for his wounds, which he feared would soon become mortal. With Tom Hill, Baker, and Morton now dead, Jesse Evans would now have a story about the killing of Tunstall that would provide plenty of opportunities to scapegoat his expired companions. The recently removed U.S. Marshal Weidenman and Governor Axtell would publish contradictory letters in the New Mexican, a journal publication out of Santa Fe that took to attacking Weidenman on the governor's behalf. Their contention hinging on the fact that Weidenman had written a letter describing the events of Tunstall's slaying to an attorney friend in San Francisco, and that the contents held within the letter and its date showed that Weidenman had taken action he could not have been authorized to take, on account of the fact that the district court had not yet convened at that point to issue the warrants, and therefore the arrest could not have been carried out under the letter of the law at the time they were issued by Weidenman. The article delivered a rhetorical assault upon Weidenman and the Regulators in an attempt to shift public opinion behind the governor and his course of action. It also painted a picture of the territory that was now under dispute, much of which stands true to this day. Quote, Lincoln is the southeast corner county of New Mexico. It is partly inhabited by Indians, the Mescalero Apache, who blows where he listeth, by Texas cattlemen, a few traders and businessmen, and a few skeleton companies of the United States troops. The letter provoked Weidenman to offer a rebuttal. Quote, the comments, like all others made by the gentlemanly editors, are full of Billingsgate and blatherskite. Mud and dirt are, as usual, freely thrown, and I with others am of the opinion that the editors unfortunately mistake their calling. Weidenman, clearly on the attack, proceeded to call into question not only the publication, but the actions of the lawmen of Lincoln County and the governor for their biased and myopic view of the violent late winter's war. A session of court had been announced for April 1st, though it was supposed to be scheduled for the 8th. Members of the Regulators, acting independently of McSween as well as their recognized leader Dick Brewer, gathered near the court on the evening of March 31st in anticipation of the announced court session the following morning. Amongst them were Billy the Kid, Frank McNabb, Jim French, Fred Waite, Henry Middleton, and Henry Brown. They spent the evening at the Tunstall store, stoking one another's tempers and recollections of the recent injustices. Around 9 o'clock on the morning of the 1st, Sheriff Brady, along with several deputies and allies, walked from the Dolan store at the west end of town toward the courthouse. They informed prospective jurors that the court date had been announced in error and they would be convening the following Monday instead. As they walked through the town on their way to the court, they passed directly by Tunstall's store, doing so without incident. They then started to make their way back towards Dolan's headquarters. The corral at the rear of Tunstall's store was surrounded with high adobe walls with a narrow driveway on the east side of the building. The driveway had a wooden gate from which anyone approaching from the east could clearly be seen, but those approaching from the west could not be seen until they were right upon the gate, as the vantage point was blocked by the building that housed the Tunstall store. The Regulators watched through this gate as Brady and his men walked back towards Dolan's store from the courthouse. Their group was scattered about, not walking in unison, when suddenly a series of rifle shots cut through the morning air. Brady fell at once, stopped dead in his tracks. Later, his recovered body would display at least a dozen bullet wounds. His deputy, George Heineman, was pierced by a single bullet, but after managing to stagger back a few steps in the direction of the courthouse, he fell dead as well, his last words a frightened plea for water. A bystander was shot just below the hip while hoeing an onion patch, but it was only a flesh wound. As Billy the Kid and French raced over to Brady's body, accounts vary as to their motives. Some assert that it was to recover the kid's previously seized pistol, while others say that it was to take the arrest warrant Brady held for McSween. Nevertheless, Billy the Kid was then shot on the inside of his left thigh. The bullet that struck the kid and also wounded French was fired by one Deputy Matthews, who had successfully taken cover amidst the fray of gunfire. The wound French received required him to briefly take refuge in the crawl space of a local citizen's home. Weidenman was in the corral where the gunfire emanated from, but claimed he was only there to feed Tunstall's dog. While perhaps true, it became a much derided alibi. Once the gunfire had ceased and the town had quieted, the Regulators, aside from Billy the Kid, rode out of town. As they passed the outskirts of town, John Long fired 4 shots upon them from his rifle, one seriously wounding French. The Regulators returned fire and made their escape. Billy the Kid's wound, while not serious, made horseback riding highly difficult, and he would make his own exit from town a couple of days later. The latest and most daring act of violence that had yet occurred in the Lincoln County War would bring to town Captain G.A. Purington and 25 soldiers from Fort Stanton. A town-wide search, door to door, was conducted for any remaining belligerents from the attacking party. Sheriff Brady was now dead. The governor's attempts to quell the mutinous fervor amongst the Regulators had failed, and now even the military had been called in. 3 days after the attack on Brady and his men, the Regulators headed southwest out of Lincoln. Brady's deputies and Captain Purington made a round of arrests. Unable to capture any of the 6 men who participated in the shooting, they went after Robert Weidenman, who admitted to being in the corral but not to being a party to the massacre. They also took McSween's brother-in-law, a man by the last name of Shield, into custody. McSween was arrested as soon as he arrived back in town, but McSween had brought to town with him an ally from Colorado, Dr. Montague R. Leverson, who had been staying at John Chisholm's ranch. Through his connections in the Hayes administration, he was able to put pressure upon prominent New York politicians regarding their dealings with McSween. McSween, Weidenman, and Shield were all taken to Fort Stanton. McSween's wife and allies stayed at the nearby trader's post to be available to lend their support. On April 4th, just 3 days after the death of Sheriff Brady, one of the most infamous gun battles of the Old West would occur at Blazer's Mill, a sawmill and trading post that supplied beef to the Mescalero Apache. It belonged to Dr. Joseph Hoy Blazer, an Indian affairs agent, and Blazer's wife ran a diner of sorts for travelers passing through. Dick Brewer and his men had stopped in at around 11 a.m. on that unseasonably warm spring day for lunch. As the Regulators had passed through Ruidoso Valley, they had welcomed the addition of 5 new recruits, including Frank Coe and his cousin, George Coe. They piled into the Blazers' dining room, stacking their rifles against the wall, then gathered around a table awaiting their meal. Andrew Buckshot Roberts then rode up on his mule, leaving his pistol and cartridge belt as he made his way into the diner. But as he approached the front door, he caught a glimpse of several rifles stacked against the wall. He then retreated back to grab his own weapon. Roberts headed across the road to an office for the sawmill operated by Dr. Blazer. Roberts had been preparing to leave the country, but was waiting on some necessary letters to arrive there first. Buckshot Roberts was on the run because he had been a member of the posse that had shot down John Tunstall. As he made his way across the road, one of the Regulators recognized him and cried out, "Here's Buck Roberts!" Brewer was still in possession of a warrant for his arrest. Before the men had a chance to take an easy shot at Roberts, Brewer called them to restrain themselves. Then, just as he had done with Morton and Baker, Brewer attempted to bring Buckshot Roberts in peacefully. Brewer would regret his decision. Brewer sent Frank Coe, who was well acquainted with Roberts, to persuade him to surrender peacefully. Roberts asked Coe to join him in Dr. Blazer's office to discuss the situation, but Coe declined, fearing he could be taken hostage. They instead sat on the doorstep of a wide room inside the adobe structure. Coe informed Roberts of the warrant they held, and that Brewer was guaranteeing his safety, and they only wanted to deliver him to the proper authorities. Naturally, Buckshot scoffed at this. "Surrender? Never. Never while I'm alive. Kid Antrim is with you and he would kill me on sight. Don't I know what happened to Morton and Baker?" The revenge killing of Morton and Baker in Blackwater County after their arrest by the Regulators would make it nearly impossible for anyone to acquiesce to them peacefully. Add to that the assassination of Sheriff Brady, and the problem was even further compounded. Nevertheless, Coe continued to plead his case. Buckshot had earned his nickname because of his many hard battles with the natives, the Texas Rangers, and other wranglers and cowboys. He was not a large man by any measure, but he endured, in spite of having one arm crippled to the point he could not raise his rifle up to his shoulder. His body bore the scars of a hardscrabble life on the frontier, and the prospect of squaring off in a shootout with 15-1 odds did not cause him to flinch. The Regulators that were awaiting Robert's surrender grew restless, and after some time, Brewer sent George Coe, Henry Middleton, and Charles Beaudry over to attempt to arrest Roberts without incident. As Beaudry came upon the two men, he called out, "Roberts, throw up your hands!" Buckshot Roberts snarled back a defiant, "No!" and sprang up to his feet, but before he could fire off a round, Beaudry inflicted a gruesome gut shot to the wanted man. As the abdomen of Roberts flailed with agonizing intensity, he pushed through the door of the office, then threw a mattress over the doorway to barricade himself within. Through his covered position, he began to send out returning fire. His first shot cut the belt directly off the waist of Charles Beaudry. The next struck George Coe directly in his trigger finger as he went to fire his gun, severing the digit just above the knuckle, a 1 in a million shot delivered with cinematic perfection. The third shot pierced the chest of Henry Middleton, inflicting a serious wound to his lungs. And, as if he were a magnet for non-lethal gunshot injuries, another round grazed the arm of Billy the Kid. If they had any designs on waiting out Roberts to expend his ammunition, they would be disappointed. It was revealed to them that the office he had taken refuge in also housed Dr. Blazer's Springfield rifle and over 1,000 rounds of ammunition. Dick Brewer then managed to regain order of his men. He instructed them to stay out of the line of fire, and that he would take up a position to see into the doorway where Roberts was holed up within. He crossed the road and took cover behind the protection of some sizable logs lying upon the ground near the sawmill. As Brewer slowly rose his head above the lumber, Roberts saw the hat rising over the top of the logs. Roberts took aim just below the brim of the hat and fired. Brewer was struck by a bullet square between the eyes and fell dead at once. The Regulators could do nothing but watch in stunned horror from their position. Brewer had been their leader through good times and bad, and with varying degrees of efficacy, but his abrupt loss had thrown the party into total disarray. The men deserted the area without even attempting to recover the body of their fallen leader. They retreated to George Coe's residence on the Ruidoso River. Back at Blazer's mill, Buckshot Roberts was so gravely wounded through the stomach that Dr. Blazer had sent for the surgeon at Fort Stanton. But Roberts could not be saved. He passed the following day, and was buried in a grave directly adjacent to the one that had been freshly dug for Dick Brewer. Alexander McSween would soon learn of the events at Blazer's mill, and send an account of the events to the Cimarron News and Press, published on April 18th. McSween relayed the events of the two shooting incidents, the wounds to Buckshot Roberts as well as to his allied men, and the death of their leader. He would eulogize Brewer in the statement, quote, "Richard M. Brewer was one of nature's noble men, physically faultless, generous to a fault, a giant in friendship, possessing an irreproachable character and unsullied honor. Kind, amiable, and gentle in disposition, he has fallen early into the 3x6 promised him 18 months ago. Murderers and horse thieves hated him. Their friends hated him. But the people, Mexican and American, held him in the highest possible esteem." The loss of Brewer was not just the death of an honorable man in an increasingly violent and unnecessary conflict. It represented the loss of order within the roughshod rank and file of the Regulators. Brewer presented an outwardly civil and organized face to the public in regards to the group. The remaining members could be considered to be varying degrees of law-abiding, with some being downright despised. The vacant sheriff position would be filled by John Copeland, who was appointed as Sheriff Brady's successor, but after a short time it was ascertained that he would not be wholly favorable towards Murphy and Dolan's interests, opting instead for a neutral position in an effort to restore peace to Lincoln. Copeland would eventually be relieved of his command and replaced by George Pepin. George Pepin was one of Brady and Dolan's oldest allies in the territory. Pepin was easily swayed. He exhibited a relatively weak demeanor, certainly in comparison to Brady, and could be instructed to do the bidding of the House complicitly. Sheriff Pepin would continue the use of deputized members of the Murphy-Dolan faction, including Jesse Evans, who was also a suspect in the death of John Tunstall. Along with the Jesse Evans gang already aggressive involvement, the Seven Rivers Warriors began posturing to make a move in the ongoing Lincoln County conflict. News came out of Roswell, at the time just a small 2 or 3 house settlement 60 miles east of Lincoln. The crux of the matter was the favorable court ruling McSween had won the month prior. A letter was published in the Las Vegas Gazette on April 28th, written by one Marion Turner. Quote, "As far as legal proceedings are concerned, the difficulties in Lincoln County were settled on the 15th of this month. The change to the grand jury by Judge Bristol was denunciatory in the action of McSween and laudatory to the opposite party, the head of which is supposed to be Major Murphy and the firm of J.J. Dolan and Company. My firm belief is that although the adherents of these parties have been guilty in, quote, killing their enemies, there was no murder in the matter, but a contest for, quote, the best of the fight." Turner was clearly unhappy with the result that favored McSween, but even beyond that, he attempted to reframe Lincoln County violence as being a byproduct of war and not actions that were subjectable to laws of homicide and mayhem. The, quote, Pecos men, the Seven Rivers Warriors, also took umbrage with a statement by Dick Brewer's successor as leader of the Regulators, Frank McNabb. McNabb had made a statement after the favorable McSween ruling that the Regulators intended to, quote, close out all who had been involved with cattle wrangling in Lincoln County. The Seven Rivers people were notorious for their cattle thievery. McNabb said that they would soon come down to, quote, clean them up. One of the Seven Rivers Warriors' loudest voices rebuked this, stating, "What do they think we are, a pack of mice?" On the 29th, the Seven Rivers Warriors had reached the location of the Fritz Ranch, roughly 8 miles south of Lincoln. There were 35 men in total. With them was George Pepin and several other Murphy-Dolan loyalists. Frank McNabb, Frank Coe, and Ab Sanders were traveling after dinner in Lincoln towards their farm in Hondo. As they rounded a bend, they were spotted by a detachment of the Seven Rivers Warriors men, who had recognized the Regulators at once, as McNabb had stood out to them. In unison, McNabb, Coe, and Sanders were fired upon. McNabb was mortally wounded. His recovered body would exhibit numerous bullet holes. Sanders fell from his steed. He had survived, but was terribly wounded himself. Coe had jumped from his horse and managed to come away unscathed. He would scurry into a recess in the hillside and keep up a continuous fire until running out of munitions. Coe then surrendered under the assurance that his life would be spared, and, as he was not the primary target, which Frank McNabb had been, he acquiesced. Coe was taken to Fort Stanton to be treated for his wounds. The Seven Rivers Warriors men then descended upon Lincoln under the cover of night, stationing themselves within the Dolan store. They stated that they wanted to be granted permission to deliver the same frontier justice to Alexander McSween and his adherents that they had wrought upon Sheriff Brady. One Captain Saturnino Baca refused to be party to this murderous scheme. The Seven Rivers men spent the night in town and conspired to make an attack, but when dawn arrived and illuminated the town of Lincoln, they saw Ellis's place, tightly shut and guarded. Within were several McSween allies, armed and ready for battle. The Seven Rivers men instead opted to offer their help to Sheriff Copeland to make arrests for those involved in the death of Sheriff Brady and Deputy Hindman. Upon receiving this correspondence, Copeland sent word to Fort Stanton that soldiers were needed in town to prevent the outbreak of violence between the two mobilizing factions. George Coe had been stationed atop the roof of the Ellis store, and he took a shot at one of the Seven Rivers men in his line of sight. The man he shot turned out to be Charlie Cruling, known familiarly as Dutch Charlie. The shot struck him in the ankle, shattering the bone. The two opposing sides then began firing upon one another, and as the town was on the precipice of civil war, 14 soldiers arrived from Fort Stanton to put an end to the skirmish, at least for the time being. But the decisive battles to come in the battle for Lincoln County are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you for joining us in this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the Join button below. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.